This video lecture is going to try and address the question of why Europe in particular why Europe in particular became the most dominant region of the world after about the year 1500. Here you've got a painting of a scene that should be familiar to you after studying Spain's conquest of the New World. So the question is really like, why does Europe in particular not only conquer the Americas, but why are they in a position to conquer the Americas in the first place? I think it's helpful to think about the world as four world zones, and this actually comes from a guy named David Christian, who developed a history curriculum called Big History, and he breaks up the world and its continents really into four world zones. World Zone 1 is Africa, Europe, and Asia, which is all basically connected. Even countries like Japan or Britain, or even these islands are close enough to the mainlands of Europe, Africa, or Asia that people could easily get there without having to build like really good technology. World Zone 2 was essentially cut off from World Zone 1 after the last ice age. So it used to be that Alaska and Russia were connected, but after the last ice age, the land bridge that was exposed that allowed people to walk between these two regions was covered in water. And so they couldn't actually get between these two world zones unless people developed technology that could get them across pretty much the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. World Zone 3 is Australia, which maybe 50,000 years ago was actually humans actually were able to make a migration to Australia, partly because there was more land exposed. And again, after the last ice age, Australia was kind of cut off from the rest of World Zone 1. And then World Zone 4 is basically the small collection of islands around the Pacific. And these islands pretty much were inaccessible to humans until maybe 2,000 years ago and up to about 500 years ago, when humans were able to develop the technology to get to these islands using boats. So, moral of the story here is that especially between World Zone 1 and World Zone 2, there's this big gap, and so they're developing in isolation. They have exchange networks that only apply to those two world zones. And so if those world zones were to connect, one would probably have an advantage over the other because they've been developing in isolation. And so you could probably guess that World Zone 1, which has better crops, better animals, and a larger area, and all the reasons that we've discussed from guns, germs, and steel, World Zone 1 is going to have more surplus and better technology than World Zone 2 when they meet. Some of this also just comes from the fact, I know I'm going on a lot right here, but some of this comes from the fact that people were in World Zone 1 longer than they were in World Zone 2. So just another thing to think about, World Zone 1 had quite a head start. If you remember, humans actually began in Africa. Okay, so just as a couple of things to review, we have Yali's question, which is this idea that only some regions of the world have the ability to create an agricultural surplus early on, and those regions often had the right animals too. So for instance, the Fertile Crescent had donkeys, the Andes had guinea pigs, so one is better than the other for producing agricultural surpluses. The Fertile Crescent is going to be the region that's going to first develop agricultural surpluses, but don't forget that India, China, the Nile River, these are right behind the Fertile Crescent in terms of developing agricultural surpluses. So these regions can trade their innovations and spread their innovations so as the humans in those areas can like advance more quickly. Another term to remember is cultural diffusion. So in World Zone 1, there was this huge network of overland exchange known as the Silk Road, but there was also this Indian Ocean maritime network, where people are trading innovations all over World Zone 1. This, as far as we know, didn't exist to such a degree in World Zone 2. So World Zone 1 had better agricultural surpluses, they had more people, they had people there for longer, so they developed a better system of exchange than, say, the Americas. So, innovations from everyone from Sumer to Europe were passed along and improved upon in World Zone 1. A good example of this is that by the 15th century, the Portuguese were developing really, really advanced ships that were kind of like updates of ships that Arabs had already developed. And they were big enough to take you on long journeys. They were really sturdy. They had cannons on board. So they were just these like traveling war machines. And even though the Arabs actually had these kinds of ships, one difference here is that the Arabs were mostly operating on the Indian Ocean, which the Indian Ocean actually had really bad storms that came from monsoons and made crossing the Indian Ocean a lot more dangerous than crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That's going to become important later on. And you also have navigational tools. So while Muslims in Saudi Arabia and throughout Muslim nations were developing really complex ways of mapping the world, these mapping tools would be put to use by Europeans who had better access to ocean. So things like the compass, things like geometric cartography, these things would actually be perfected by the Arabs and then passed on to the Europeans who would have a better use for them on the Atlantic Ocean. So let's dig a little deeper into why Europe in particular is the one that's going to bridge World Zone 1 and World Zone 2. Okay, so there are a good 6 factors we're going to look at here. Geography, the church, feudalism, military competition, business friendliness, and banks. And these are all going to actually kind of lead to one another. So in a way, it's like a flow. So first of all, we have geography. So here's a map. You've made some inferences from this map already, I hope. But some things you can pick out is that it's a high latitude, which means that crops don't grow as easily. So although that doesn't seem like an advantage at first, it makes people work hard and innovate in order to actually have crops that can sustain them. So they get crops from places like the Fertile Crescent, but then they have to kind of use their noggins and figure out a better way to actually make the crops work. You also have really low topography, which means that for the most part, Europe is pretty well connected to one another. You have lots of rivers that help fuel this connection, and rivers actually kind of put a lot of water into the soil. And this is going to get kind of nerdy, but basically, if you have lots of rivers, you have waterlogged soil, and people had to work really hard to till this soil. They actually had to work in teams, and what this meant is that over time, Europeans from tilling the soil had to develop teams outside of their family networks, which other agricultural societies didn't always have to do. And so it kind of led to more trust and communication between families. You also had high precipitation that helped crops grow, but also helped this waterlogged soil. And almost most importantly, you have a small area and lots of coastlines. So not only do you have people communicating in Europe quite a bit, passing on ideas and whatnot, you have access to this huge coastline. Okay, so just for some perspective, this is about the size of Europe compared to the United States. So Europe is actually smaller in land area than the U.S., although it has more people than the U.S. today. So it's small and densely populated. So just for some perspective, here's Europe. We talked about how it can get ideas from the rest of the exchange networks in World Zone 1. We also talked about how it's got a relatively small area, so innovations quickly spread. But almost most importantly, they're right next to the Atlantic Ocean. So they're next to a waterway that's better than the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean has lots of big storms that kind of blow through, and it makes traveling hard. It's also easily accessible to this kind of ocean highway, and it's closer basically to West Africa and World Zone 2. So if every country had the same advantages, Europe would still be the first country to reach the Americas because it's just closer. So here's a map of what you might call the Age of Exploration that kind of starts after the Spanish and Portuguese. And you can just see which regions are closer to the Americas, so which regions are ideally going to get there quicker. Another big thing is the Catholic Church in Europe. The church was like a cultural unifying force, just like Islam. And so most all of Europe was Christian after about the year 1500, and most of it was actually Christian after the fall of Rome. So you have a unified cultural force that is the church. Some other benefits of this church is scholarship. So monks actually were kind of the first scholars of Europe, just like there were Islamic scholars. They're studying the Bible, and they're studying eventually things like Greek philosophy to help them interpret the Bible. The church also provides a lot of wealth. People gave money to the church, and the church pooled money and then was able to actually give money back to various ventures that made sense. So the church was kind of like a big bank for a while. And this one is often overlooked, but the church was a really positive force for people. So it gave people a sense of hope. It gave them a sense of purpose. So, for instance, some of the first Spanish and Portuguese not only were looking for wealth, they were looking for a way to kind of advance and glorify God. So it gave people a sense of purpose. Another big innovation or thing that's going to help Europe is feudalism. You may have studied this before, but basically feudalism was this decentralization of power, which means no one really had complete control over Europe. Feudalism itself, it's a system in which landowners own the land, and they hold the land from the king. So they are, in a way, kind of renting it. The people who work the land basically get protection from the people who rent the land. So in another way of thinking about this, the farmers are the people who work the land. They get to live off the land, they get protection from the land, and they pay a certain amount of what they farm to the ruling landowners, who then pay a certain amount of that to the king. So it's kind of this decentralized system which occurred after Rome fell. All those barbarians that overran Rome, those actually would become the first French, the first Germans, the first Spanish, but no one had complete control after the fall of Rome for quite a while. And actually to this day, no one really has complete control over Europe. And that means that everybody had these small little decentralized kingdoms that fought with one another almost constantly. So although the king is going to rule over all these landlords, the landlords have a lot of independence. And so you have this social stratification where you have peasants at the bottom, knights above peasants, tenants in chief or landowners above the knights, and then the king. This means that you have lots of little smaller regions that are all kind of without a ruler over them. So what this is going to lead to is military competition. Every single ruler is vying to try and become like the top dog. So they're all constantly waging war with one another. The knights are becoming these like hired hands. And this also leads to a lot of competition and a lot of new military technology and new military tactics and this very kind of violent society. Europe was not a very pleasant place around the time of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. It was a very violent, military-oriented culture, and a violent, military-oriented culture that was united with a common Christian purpose. So it's almost this like ultimate monster created for conquering. In addition to this, the feudal structure meant that merchants had a lot of independence. There's no one like clamping down on merchants. So farmers can sell their excess crops at markets. There's no unified currency, so it's not like everybody had $1 or £1 British. Um, and the merchants just kept the profits that they made. They didn't have to give them to kings. They didn't have to give them to anyone. And so merchants started to rise during this atmosphere. And this in turn would lead to banks rising. So certain merchants pooled money from banks. Um, the kings and the armies needed money to fund their wars, and so these big banks develop, which become these like holding places for surpluses of money that could later fund things like explorers going to the New World. A good example of this are the Medici family. This was a family of merchants that eventually became so powerful that they were rulers of Europe. Some of them became popes. And this was just a family that made their money from being merchants. And the Medici family funded all kinds of different wars from different regions of Europe throughout the 13, 14, 1500s. So, what else helped Europe? One thing is that they just got really good cultural diffusion. So they learned of these classics from the Roman Empire, the Greeks, the Persians, the Arabics. Um, they Hindu math, Arabic geometry. All of these things made their way towards Europe, and this helped Europe. But you also had technological advancements. So things like the gunpowder. Gunpowder came from China, which would lead to guns. Um, although China came up with gunpowder actually for like celebratory events, the Europeans, which was this very competitive, violent military culture, quickly figured out that you could put these in guns and shoot people with them. Um, Later, we'll learn that Europe also develops the printing press, which is going to help diffuse ideas throughout Europe, which will further help like reinforce the advantages that Europe actually had. They get things like catapults. Europe is like this breeding ground for new technological advancements that could help one feudal society take over another. Um, you also have the Mongol conquest. Now, this is something that John Green in his Crash Course videos is always talking about, the Mongols and what a big deal they are. And they are worth studying. They're a fascinating kind of case study in historical patterns being broken by the Mongols. But most important for Europe, the Mongols are this like just ridiculous military nomadic force that sweeps from China all the way to Europe, and it weakens some of these really strong empires that had dominated before Europe. By the time it gets to Europe, in some ways it's kind of run out of steam, and it's expanded as much as it can. But the Mongols, they weaken the Islamic Empire. They weaken China. They weaken even all of these uh, um, India. They become this force that just destroys a lot of previously strong rulers, and they don't quite make it to Western Europe. They spread military technology, they spread ideas, they actually have the first wide-scale postal network. So in a way, they weaken these old empires while increasing communication and innovation between the empires. So it's kind of like just shoving all these things towards Europe. Um, you also have the Black Death, and this is going to seem like kind of a disadvantage, but actually the death rates of places in China, for instance, were a lot higher than in Europe. Um, and the Mongol conquest actually kind of brings more of this Black Death. In fact, the Mongols would do things like catapult infected bodies into cities to kind of spread the Black Death. And in certain cities, like for instance Venice, you had 40% of the population dying. But this has unforeseen positive consequences. So in total, you have maybe 200 million people who died, and in Europe, that number is pretty substantial. But this actually is going to lead to, for instance, people becoming more resistant to Catholic dominance. So people start thinking for themselves a little bit. It eases strain on Europe's carrying capacity, which means there's less people for the same amount of food. And so that allows new people to kind of rise up and have a better quality of life. Um, it allows new opportunities. So a lot of farmers and merchants and political leaders die, so you have new people who have to come in and take over. And this also increases the focus on things like medicine and humanism. Um, this Black Death also exposes Europe's population to a disease, and only the survivors obviously are going to survive, and they're going to have the immunity to this disease. By the time this disease makes its way to other countries, Europeans are going to be immune and will survive. Other countries will die. And so this immunity to disease is a big reason why, as some say, as much as 90% of the population in the Americas died from disease. So, last thing, why does Europe maintain its dominance? So let's go back to our map, World Zone 1, World Zone 2. We've started to see not only why World Zone 1 has such a clear advantage over World Zone 2, but also why Western Europe is going to become the force that's going to conquer World Zone 2. Here, red is actually Spain, blue is Portugal, and this is going to be pretty soon after 1500. So this is kind of after the Spanish conquest and the Portuguese conquest. As you can see, these two tiny little countries have this huge outside empire, not only in the Americas, but also in parts of like southern and West Africa and in Indonesia, where there wasn't already a big empire. So these two countries are going to expand their force basically through maritime conquest, military technology, and disease, that guns, germs, and steel. But remember this map for a second. We also have the Portuguese and Spanish that are taking raw materials from places like the Americas and bringing it back to Europe. So you have massive influxes of things like silver, but also things like tobacco, sugar. This is just going to lead to more surpluses, which leads to more advantages. It's this kind of positive feedback loop, this acceleration. So all that extra money and surpluses from the New World goes back to Western Europe, and it spreads, and it increases innovation, and it means that the advantages that Europe had become even bigger. So Europe has this accelerating advantage after having gone to the New World. And as you can see, this is from 1800. This is essentially the way that the world is run. These colors all represent European countries. And so Europe will have a clear empire over most of the world around the 1800, and actually by 1900 Europe will almost dominate the entire world. That's for a later date, but I hope from this, even though I know it's a little longer this time, I hope from this you can better understand not only why Europe is the one that's going to actually have dominance after 1500, why Europe is going to be the one that connects the world zones, why Europe today is so wealthy. But I also hope that this is getting you to see that, wealth doesn't come from some kind of like innate ability. Wealth very often just comes from geography, and Europe happened to be in the right place at the right time. All right, that's it.